Hi everyone, this week we are going to finish the implications for developed nations, the implications of the first and second unbundlings for developed nations, and we are going to cover the implications for developing nations. Last lecture we left off at spillovers and stickiness. Remember, we distinguished two different features about different factors of production. The ability to generate positive spillovers or externalities, and the stickiness of the factors in terms of being internationally mobile or not. I mentioned in particular that the government should focus on factors, on promoting inputs and factors which produce positive spillovers while being relatively sticky. Otherwise, the government or a nation won't be able to enjoy the returns to the investments in that factor, as this factor might just leave the country, pretty much. So, even if there is a market failure due to the presence of spillovers, promoting basic science or financial capital is unlikely to affect local production. Remember, basic science and financial capital are two factors which are highly mobile. Financial capital is just a matter of wireless transfers, so as long as you have an internet connection, you're good. And basic science spreads all around the world. Basic science has high amount of positive spillovers, which might make a government want to invest in it, whereas financial capital has a very limited amount of spillovers. The idea is that those two factors go wherever its reward are the highest. If you train your population and educate your population so that it's very, very highly skilled, this population will try to go for a job that pays well. And if your country does not provide that, then no problem, especially when it comes to basic science, research, engineering jobs. Plenty of other countries have a high demand for those profiles. So, a government which provides, let's say, free education, or at least subsidizes education of those highly skilled people, will not enjoy the returns to this investment, as those people will work somewhere else. So it is better to coordinate highly mobile targets at the international level through, for instance, patent policies and large basic science projects. You can find many science projects which are the result of different countries' cooperation. In particular, if you think about Europe, Belgium has a couple of research centers. I think one of them is aerospatial, one of them is about nuclear physics, and so on, that is meant to gather researchers from all around the European Union. Research and development subsidies are less obvious, but probably still a good idea to promote at the local level, as long as its returns can be enjoyed by the local population. On the other hand, promoting technical education has a high return because people with technical education are less mobile. Highly skilled labor is internationally mobile. For instance, I could be doing research or teaching anywhere in the world now with my degree, and so could you. Any financial institution, any bank would be able to hire you with your economics degree at SFU, for instance. The way to make it less mobile is to create industrial, high-tech clusters or hubs in cities and around universities. So you create centers that are going to favor the production of knowledge so that people don't have an incentive to go somewhere else. They want to work in favorable conditions, and they might try to stick to their country. Human capital is going to be key. Okay? People and skills are the most important factors of production regarding competitiveness policy associated with the second unbundling. Remember, it's all about the know-how when we talk about the second unbundling. If you have the know-how, you're good. You're gonna be able to make your nest somewhere. Okay? Why is this not working? Sorry guys, my pointer is kind of weird. Let me change the battery. Okay, that works. Sorry about that. Rich, diverse set of skilled workers is both sticky and has positive externalities, especially when there is agglomeration of these workers. Remember, the creation of knowledge is even more fostered when you are around smart people. Okay? Smart people attract smart people. Same idea. So skill cluster is more than the sum of its parts. Those are the spillovers aspect. If you combine your knowledge with somebody else's knowledge, you just don't add knowledge. You're going to get something higher most of the time. You might be able to bounce off of ideas with one another and come up with something better than the original thing you had in mind. Agglomeration effects create external economies of scale. Remember, we talk about external when we are looking at an industry as a whole, because there are positive externalities associated with those agglomeration effects. You're right, there could be some internal economies of scale as well, but it's not necessarily due to pure knowledge. Internal economies of scale could be mainly due to just being able to lower your costs by increasing your production. But that could be from a different source than just skills and knowledge. Yes, I know that Canvas is not working right now. I sent the link already, and thank you guys for relaying the link on Discord. Human capital is also flexible and can adapt to changing demands. Remember, human capital is not just about learning skills, but also about learning how to learn, so that you can adapt. You can train yourself on the job. You can learn a new skill on the job, or you can maybe go back to school while working to be able to get a promotion or learn a new skill that could be useful for your job. So, to summarize the competitiveness policy aspect, with the first unbundling globalization, national technology and factors created a comparative advantage. If a country is particularly good at producing this or has a certain abundance in factors, it could be specific types of workers, or it could be being abundant in capital or in natural resources, then you have a comparative advantage. You should specialize in the production of that good, so everybody is on the same team. For instance, you could say Canada's industry of lumber. Okay? You have an endowment in natural resources that makes extraction of wood relatively easy in Canada, pretty cheap. So there is a comparative advantage in the production of wood-related products, paper, and so on, cardboard, and so on and so forth. So everybody's on the same team. With the second bundling, the North technology increasingly combines with the South labor. So we have two different types of inputs coming from two different types of countries that are going to combine. So, the nationally optimal policies must be more nuanced. It's not just about investing in the timber industry and that's it. There should be research and development subsidies, tax breaks, and so on to favor investments in specific field and in specific factors. I talked about the stickiness of some activities. It is also very important if you want to see returns to your investment as a government. Remember that any money that the government spends is money that the government took from its citizens, or a big part of it. Some of it can come from loans and so on. So, during the second unbundling, low-skilled workers in the north are going to suffer from that second unbundling globalization when we talk about jobs, job-wise. Some low skills in services won't suffer from this second unbundling, but from when it comes to manufacturing, definitely. Factories in the north close down pretty much. So, not everybody is on the same team anymore. Now, onto the industrial policy. The typical industrial policy of yesterday was about promoting manufacturing, to be able to produce the goods here and sell them there. Today, we have good manufacturing jobs without the manufacturing aspect. Remember, the servicification of manufacturing implies that a huge chunk of value added from the production of a good, of a manufactured good, relates to services. So it's not about producing the good itself, like making the components of a phone or assembling different parts to make some good. It's about all the services that come in around the creation of that good. It could be the design, it could be the marketing, it could be all kinds of logistics, and so on and so forth. Compufacturing, which is the combination of computer and factoring, implies the need for highly skilled jobs. Engineer, data scientists, and so on, who are going to be in charge of making processes automatic, while they still have to supervise them and have some control over them. Automating. Thank you. Oh, I was so far for this one. Remember the smile curve, where the value added coming from the fabrication part, the components and so on, decreased, the share of value added decreased, while the share of value added of pre-fabrication services, the design, the research, and so on, and the post-fabrication services, the marketing, the promotion, and so on, increased. We have the same thing at the more global level. Primary, manufacturing, and services, the three different sectors of goods, where the share of value added of manufacturing dropped, the one in services increased a lot, and the one in primary stayed relatively stable, sometimes decreased, sometimes increased. So, are developed nations going to lose some jobs? Lose them all? The global value chain competition among G7 nations means that G7 manufacturing firms have to offshore to stay competitive with other G7 firms doing the same. Remember the prisoner's dilemma about protectionism in free trade? Here it is very similar, offshoring or onshoring. If your competitor is going to offshore and benefit from lower costs, hence be more competitive and increase its profits, then you as a firm should react the same way, follow suit, and also offshore. So once one firm offshores, all the others should follow if they want to stay on the market. So it's very hard to control or stop and hard to define. It's very specific per industry, per type of good, and it's also very individual. There is this mistake to try to force firms to keep all jobs onshore. Here's an example. Dyson is a British company. Might not be English, but at least it's British. And for which is it better to move production to Malaysia to benefit from very low manufacturing costs, especially at the fabrication level, so that Dyson can invest in design, research, promotion, and so on, with more engineers employed by British firms? Or is it better to keep all of the production in the UK? Costs stay high, and then the company cannot invest in services around the fabrication of the good itself. So here, by moving the production to Malaysia and cutting on some costs, Dyson is also able to invest in other parts of the fabrication process. And for that, they will need British engineers. So, low-skilled workers working in British Dyson factories will lose their job. They will suffer from offshoring, whereas highly skilled workers, like engineers, will benefit from that because Dyson can invest in research and development, marketing, and so on and so forth. And here typically we have pains and gains from the second-hand bundling globalization, which are very specific. So not everybody is on the same team anymore. Not all Dyson workers are on the same team. Some of them would like to offshore because they can maybe benefit from it. Others definitely don't want Dyson to offshore, otherwise they're going to lose their job. For a certain amount of time, some French presidential election candidates were advocating for the back to made in France. Not only the extreme right wing was going for that, because of course they are also all about the made in France and so on, but also other different parties were thinking about we need to put more things in the production of our goods. We need to put more French labor into it. Doesn't necessarily relate to the manufacturing aspect, but also the services and so on. And so he wanted a return to the made in France tag. The made in France or the made in some country tag is a tag that firms are allowed to put on their products, but according to different rules depending on where you are at. So if you are producing within the European Union, or if you're a firm whose headquarters are located in the European Union, the conditions to put made in France or made in Belgium or made in Spain on their tag is going to be different than if you are a firm located in the US or in Canada or in Japan or Korea and so on. In some countries, it's all about having 70% of the production process or a majority of the production process happening in the country where you want to have your label. Things like that. Well, made in France is not a bad idea. After all, France has a lot of know-how. They have a lot of tradition they have a huge tradition in making some types of goods, in particular some foods in agriculture. At the same time, firms want to be able to compete as well. Otherwise, they won't be able to charge low prices and they're going to lose market shares. So there is this trade-off that firms have to figure out. And especially when it comes to manufacturing goods like vacuum cleaners made by Dyson, definitely the manufacturing process can be offshored to benefit from lower costs. And to invest in services around the production of Tyson products, especially when a country like UK, France, US, and so on are highly endowed in highly skilled workers. I talked about cities before, hubs, centers, to benefit from agglomeration effects. Now, one should look at cities as a 21st century factory as a whole. Urban clusters of talented, diverse service workers may be the best response to new high-tech, low-wage competition. This quote from, I believe, Baldwin, I forgot to cite it, says, cities should not be thought of as a mere collection of people, but rather as complex workspaces that generate new ideas and new ways of doing things. So cities can be seen as skill clusters or brain hubs. And this is why some cities now are known for gathering a specific type of knowledge. If you think about San Francisco, you think about Silicon Valley, for instance. That's one of them. If you think about Singapore, you think about real estate and finance in general. If you think about New York, you think about finance. If you think about Toronto, that probably would be finance. But they are an agglomeration of activities because there are many more activities like architects, marketing designers, and so on, which are also part of the cities, and they get to interact with each other and benefit from each other's ideas. Knowledge economy has an inherent tendency towards geographical agglomeration because of those positive spillovers. Also, cities being big hubs, they benefit from lower transportation costs rather than having different things scattered over a country. Coordination gets easier. And there's a large supply and demand for labor, lower search costs, and faster matching. You don't hear very often people born in the city going to the countryside to find a job because it's going to be very hard to get a match there. They usually go to the countryside once they have a job, and the job entails working in the countryside. Otherwise, it's usually people from the countryside moving to a city because this is where things happen. I am one of them. I am from the countryside, and once I got a level of education that was high enough, I figured there's going to be no opportunity for me here. I need to go to something bigger if I want to find something. And as I mentioned before, knowledge spillovers between firms or external economies of scale here, thanks to those spillovers. Comparing cities with rural areas, well, cities are more than ever the engine of growth because of those positive spillovers. Think about Canada, for instance. More than 50% of Canada's GDP was accounted by the 6 agglomerations with more than 1 million people. Toronto, the biggest, Montreal, second biggest, Vancouver, third, Calgary, Edmonton, and Ottawa, Gatineau, where most of the government jobs are. These 6 agglomerations represent 47% of the total population, so a bit less than half, but in terms of GDP, they represent more than half. And at the provincial level, every time there is one city that accounts for most of the GDP of their province. Winnipeg has more than 60% of Manitoba's GDP. Vancouver contributes 56% of BC's GDP, and Halifax, Montreal, Toronto contribute for more than 50% as well. And you can see here, every time, it's one city per province. Usually the capital, I say usually because Vancouver is not the capital of the province, nor Montreal is the capital of the province of Quebec. If you think about the United States, it is pretty much the same. You have 5 big metropolitan areas, 2 in Texas, Dallas, Houston. I would advise going to Austin. I haven't been to Dallas and Houston, but Austin is a great city. Very great city, great vibe. Los Angeles, gigantic. Miami in Florida, and New York. And they dominate business creation. Between them, from 2010 to 2014, these 5 metro areas produce as big an increase in businesses as the rest of the nation combined. Note that these areas are pretty much located on the Sun Belt. I don't know if you've heard of the Sun Belt, but you can draw some kind of a belt going from New York down to Florida, then taking the south and going back up on California, which represents most of the economic activity in the US now. So policies are needed to make cities work, from physical to social infrastructure, affordability, training, any project that can also foster progress. For instance, the Rotterdam or Amsterdam in the Netherlands is planning to create a circular economy within 5 or 10 years. So they're planning to move to a net zero waste economy where everything is being reused one way or another. Those projects attract highly skilled workers who are going to attract further highly skilled workers. And those policies are what is going to make cities work. And because spillovers lead to agglomeration, it is more and more difficult to have spread areas with like a couple of towns and cities here and there. Usually if you have small cities, small towns, there usually is one bigger one in the middle. Even if it's not that big, it's still bigger than the small towns that gathers more services than all the small towns. Because of this agglomeration, employment and growth within countries are regionally more unequal. Canada is a very good example of that. As soon as you go above Calgary and think about, or Edmonton is higher, Edmonton, and think about everything above Edmonton in any province in Canada, activity is very, very slow, very small. Maybe Quebec City is a bit above Edmonton, I'm not even sure. But pretty much everything else is below Edmonton. And this is where maybe 80 or 90% of the economy is. And here, there is a dilemma. Do you promote the creation of cities because of those spillover effects? You want to increase productivity. You want to increase competitiveness. We also saw that cities, big cities, increase stickiness of factors. They allow some factors like basic science or things like that to be sticky because the city provides for these factors. Or do you promote regions through redistributive policies because you do not want these regions to fall behind? There is a huge problem in France and probably in Canada as well, but in many Western countries, which is providing medical services in very small remote areas. In France, there are no incentives provided to medical doctors who would like to work in the countryside and work with people who are old, who are not necessarily mobile, who cannot go to the next big city a couple hours away by car to to get care, and so on. In Canada, I know that those programs subsidize doctors a lot. So a doctor can make more money by working in St. John's in northern BC and so on and so forth. But it is a big problem. Those small towns tend to be inhabited by a rather old population that needs to be taken care of. The older population is the one that needs medical care more than anybody else, except babies. So it is very complicated to maintain the provision of basic health services, among other services, in those areas, since there are not many incentives for people to move there. To sum up the industrial policy part, developed nation countries should stop thinking about manufacturing exports, but start thinking about services that go around the manufactured exports. After all, G7 countries are the one also creating and producing know-how, so they are the ones who need. They are the sectors that should be invested in, the type of jobs that should be invested in. So stop thinking about what a good sector is as a whole, but start thinking about what a good job is, which usually is going to be a service. Stop thinking about domestic factories as the industrial base and start thinking of the service sector as the main industrial base. Finally, stop thinking about cities as being just an agglomeration of people, but rather production hubs where there are knowledge spillovers, positive externality, that nurture a rapid combination of diverse world-class services. And the more developed a city is, the more efficient it is, the more it gathers knowledge, and knowledge attracts knowledge. Now, let me move on to trade policy, the last part of the 5 different policies that developed nations need to rethink. 20th century trade, until 1990s, we were still in the first unbundling. So goods were crossing borders, but goods were created under the same roof. You have 2 factories here, and stage A, B, and C all happen within the same factory. In the 21st century, goods, know-how, ideas, capital, people are moving. So now inputs are crossing borders. It is very hard to regulate. It is more individual because of that. And this is something that countries need to rethink. So, in the first unbundling, it was about goods crossing borders, and agreements were just about helping firms sell goods. So we agree to lower our tariffs on this if you agree to lower your tariffs on that, so that my firms can sell to you and your firms can sell to me. Basic RTA, shallow provisions pretty much. In the second unbundling, now factories can cross borders and even production inputs alone can cross borders. So there is a more interconnected flow of goods, services, capital, technicians. So agreements now are about helping them sell goods, but also make goods, which is why we have seen this increase in the number of bilateral investment treaties, and this increasing in deep provisions in regional trade agreements. Now it's not just about, oh, I'm going to lower my tariffs to help you sell goods to me and vice versa, but rather I'm also going to help you invest in my country if you're interested in my workers, if you're interested in producing something in my country. I'm going to protect your investments. I might protect your copyrights if you manage to create something in my country. I'm going to help you prevent counterfeiting products, and so on and so forth. So the key rethinks are necessary. They are based on intra-factory flows, what happens from one factory to another, based on the fact that comparative advantage is not just about a country having a comparative advantage. It's about having a nexus, think about a network, connections, links, of cross-border flows, creating a nexus of necessary disciplines. So trade agreements need to have different characteristics, coming through more in regional agreements than in World Trade Organization-based multilateral agreements. Things are more one-on-one than multilateral now, because countries need specific partners for specific tasks for specific reasons. So now regionalism matters more than ever over globalism. Discrimination is very difficult now because it's not just about product trade, which you could do before. For instance, you can think of the USMCA, United States, Mexico, Canada, which is the new NAFTA agreement that contains way more deep provisions and so on. Discrimination is easy when it's just about products. Oh, I'm going to put a tariff on your milk, or I'm going to lower my tariff on the meat you sell to me. Okay, that's fairly easy. You have a category, you have a tariff for it. But now, it is difficult with other international aspects. How do you do when it's not just about meat being sold to you, but it's about a firm from their country working in yours for a specific task of the production process? It is also very hard to define nationality of these in the modern world, especially when you think about patents, know-how, capital. It's very hard to say the capital is coming from there. After all, this is just money. So many recent RTA provisions dealing with these aspects tend to have non-discriminatory provisions. They apply to everyone, not just to trade with members. And you can see it with the number of RTAs as opposed to the number of deep provisions. The number of RTAs has increased since the 1990s, has been fairly flat over time. Positive, but fairly flat. There has been an increase, but what's more interesting is to look at the increase in deep provisions. Those RTAs now contain way more conditions than just lower tariffs. By regional, I mean country to country, or it could be region by region, depending on what you call a region. But it's not just about having 20 countries having lower tariffs. Now it's more about, well, Japan in a specific sector is investing in France for the production of a certain good. And so then it's more like a country to country relationship now. That is what I mean. Which is why regional trade agreements include more deep provisions. Those deep provisions are going to be different across RTAs. The RTAs made in the European Union contain a bunch of deep provisions that other RTAs don't contain. But when you're thinking about World Trade Organization, you're thinking about all the countries, or most of them, applying the same tariffs to the same types of products, where it applies to everybody. So RTAs have become a package that includes deep provisions. And so this is also leading to a different political economy. In the first unbundling, it was just about exchange of market access. Lower tariffs would give you access to a whole new market. In the second unbundling, it's about making it easier to do business abroad and keep international production facilities connected. The implications are the creation of mega bilaterals. So United States, European Union, and Canada, or Japan and European Union. They're mega in the sense that they contain a lot of now deep provisions. Other countries do this more unilaterally, like a Canadian firm, Kodiak, who makes specific type of shoes, like kind of boots. Offshores the shoe production in Thailand. Then Canada lowers import tariffs on this type of shoes. You also have the creation of mega regional that goes beyond bilaterals. So the new Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, or the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnerships that gather a bunch of countries and contain also a bunch of deep provisions. So the World Trade Organization does not have much to offer regarding the second unbundling. There is an erosion of the World Trade Organization importance in world trade governance. World Trade Organization is not that useful anymore. We are already in a stage where tariffs are relatively low for everyone. So it loses its influence. Trade agreements, and especially bilateral agreements, have adjusted a lot to the second unbundling. Now, all those deep provisions I mentioned are a network of rules because global value chains cover a network of nations. So, I have been repeating myself a lot in the past slides just to make you understand that there is a big difference between the first unbundling and the second unbundling, especially in terms of complexity. To summarize the implications for developed nations. Northern know-how is confined in global value chains and scattered over the globe. Wherever this know-how is needed, it is going to go. So rich nations' policies have to be rethought. I mentioned industrial, trade, social, competitiveness. There might have been a fifth one. Which one was it? Forgot the fifth one. Oh yes, education policy. Thank you. Yes. Stickiness and spillovers are going to matter a lot to determine which factors of production should be a government should invest in. Cities. So the way a country is structured demographically is going to matter a lot. Cities can be seen as production hubs, as a way to attract high skills, to attract knowledge, and favor positive spillovers. And finally, a focus on workers, not on the job themselves. If some jobs have to be terminated because production is offshored, so be it. That's how competition works. However, one should focus on the workers who are going to lose this job, help them train themselves, change sectors, and move on to their next life. The focus should be on services around manufacturing, not on manufacturing itself. Manufacturing has been standardized since the first unbundling. Production processes have been refined, and now finding costs cuts in the production itself, in the fabrication itself, is harder and harder. The biggest innovations have already been made. If now there's a new innovation such as a laser or something like that, it won't cut costs by a huge amount as opposed to before. So now that manufacturing is fairly standardized and that cutting costs becomes hard, when it comes to the fabrication itself, then focus on other costs, like labor costs. Then focus on everything else, such as services around the production of the good. Adapt to new changes, don't resist them. That's how the economy is. It sucks if you lose your job because your factory closes down, but unfortunately there is probably nothing you can do about it. So, suck it up. I'm sorry to say that. Like, I'm not saying that to you guys, but I'm saying that to whoever is going to lose his job. And if it was my case, well, that would suck for me too, but I'll be like, yeah, my job is terminated. I'm not going to protest for my job to stay here. That's what liberal economies are about. Make your firm here, and if you don't want to have your firm here anymore, just close it down, open it somewhere else. Yes, some jobs are going to be lost, but also some other jobs are going to be created. So use that as an opportunity to change fields, to train yourself, to learn something new, and who knows, maybe you're going to find something else you enjoy. Exactly, an opportunity to grow, absolutely. It is hard to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And especially when you look at the past 40 years, so our parents pretty much, they have been not stuck, but they have been kind of educated to believe that they have to get a job around 18 or in the beginning of their 20s and get the same job, keep the same job for 40 years, get promoted, go up in the hierarchy, but keep the same job until they retire. This is not how things are now. Things are more uncertain, more stressful for us, definitely. My mom is always like, oh, young people today, whatever, they are like more depressed or they're doing weird stuff. It's like, well, we don't live in the same conditions. Getting a degree is not a guarantee that you're going to get a job or that you're going to get a good job, in the sense that it's going to be a job that will help you repay your tuition fees, for instance. And it's so specialized that it is hard to get a job in something that you didn't do. If you have a bachelor in economics, you will only be able to get jobs that say require a bachelor in economics. It's very rare to get a job with a bachelor in economics to get a job that doesn't require a bachelor in economics at all. Back in the 70s in Western countries, people with a certain degree could just do a job that was totally different and then train themselves on the spot. So there was also this window of opportunities that were coming to them. Opportunities don't come to us. We have to take them. But it's a bit different. Sure, there are more unions, but unions defend the interest of their employees, of the ones who are enrolled. If you're outside of the market, if you're looking for a job, you're not part of the union yet. So it's not really, unions are very nice once you're an insider, once you're in, once you have a job. If you're out, well, that doesn't concern you too much. Think about minimum wages. If your wage increases because of a minimum wage policy or reform, minimum wage increases and you keep your job, great, you're paid more now. But what about all the ones who lost their job because of minimum wage? Because it's a cost that many small firms cannot pay anymore, so they have to lay some people off. Or what about all those outsiders, the ones who are looking for a job, for whom it's going to be even harder now because firms' labor demand is going to decrease. Now that it is more expensive to hire someone, instead of a permanent contract, I'm going to offer part-time positions, precarious contracts. For outsiders, it is very hard then to get a loan when you only have a part-time job. It is very hard to make plans for the future, start saving when you know that your job is going to end in 3 months, and then you might go through another month of drought before you get something else. And so unions are great, but they mostly defend the interest of people who are already employed. Yeah, job security has been threatened in many countries, France in particular. Well, job security is great for those who have it. but it's very hard to get for those who don't have it. That's the idea. That's it for the implications on developed nations. Now I'm going to go over to the other side of the planet pretty much, and I'm going to look at the implications for developing countries after a 10 minutes break. I'll be back at 11:35. Okay. Let's move on to the second part. Policy implications for developing nations. I hope everybody's back. So, I talked about developed nations, and I talked about 5 different policies that were that developed nations had to rethink. So, education, social, competitiveness, industry, and trade. Now, let's move on to the developing nations part. For them, the implications are going to be very different because the second unbundling is going to have very different impacts on them. This course content is partly taken, if not fully, from SFU professor Nicolas Schmidt's notes. However, I am entirely responsible for any mistake, and I do not legally allow this content to be published without my consent. So, let's think about the traditional thinking about industrial development. The mainline thinking about development has seen 3 different ways. The first idea, from 1945 to 1982, was what they call the big push. Big push, you can think of this as being a massive investment in one's industry to make it competitive. So, the import substitution strategy would be used, and thus protectionism. So, the import substitution strategy consists in imposing tariffs on imports so that now your domestic firms have to be the ones producing the good for the domestic consumers. So, that pretty much corresponds to protectionism so that an industry can develop and become competitive. Big idea number 2 that came a bit later, from 1982 to 2002. 1982, is that Ronald Reagan? That's probably Ronald Reagan because he was pretty open to markets and things like that. The idea is to free market and free trade. I'm going to talk about this quickly. Yes, Reaganomics, absolutely. Many tried, few succeeded. There is this puzzling success of Asia, especially China, and I will go over not the Chinese case, but I will go over the Korean case in a bit. And the third idea after 2002 is surrender. After all, there is no one best way to conduct policies about industrial developments. So maybe the right approach is to give up on recipes that work for everybody and rather to look at recipes that work for yourself. Okay, let me check something with the chat, but if I can't do it quickly, I'm going to resume the lecture. I changed the name of one of you guys to put a 1. Did it work? How many? Why are there like 20 Jasprit Singh? Okay, I have to move on. Sorry, guys. Figure it out by yourself. So, let's go over the big idea number 1. The big push. So, development is a virtuous cycle driven by external economies. Underdeveloped countries have failed to get the virtuous circle going. The idea is to get this virtual cycle spinning. And what can we do to start this circle? It's the big push. You reserve the local market to local production by raising tariffs. So you protect yourself from abroad industries like India did, Korea, Taiwan back then, and so on. Guys, I need to give a lecture, so I cannot just spend my time figuring out the stuff on the chat. So maybe you can just put your name when you start a chat or something. I need to move on, okay? So this is what we call the import substitution strategy. So import substitution industrialization strategy, ISI. So the idea is that there is a lumpiness in the industrialization process. A nation has a comparative advantage in manufacturing, but is stuck in what we call a bad equilibrium. The idea is that we have two equilibria. Usually we have more. If you have a strong industry base, a wide industrial base, then the nation is competitive in this industry. It's a good equilibrium. You have a comparative advantage. You sell to your local consumers and you sell abroad. And you are keeping the virtual circle going. Remember, by increasing the scale of your production, chances are you're going to benefit from internal economies of scale, which will make you even more competitive, which are going to be even better. If your industry is rather small, if you have little industry and no industrial base, the problem is that the nation is not competitive in that industry, and so the nation will not be able to first be competitive for its own consumers, and second, be competitive at the international level. So many underdeveloped countries were stuck in this bad equilibrium because they had no industrial base. They had no base to start with to be competitive. And in this case, they needed a big push, a big investment to switch from the bad equilibrium to the good one. Government policy pushes resources into an industry through subsidies, investment, tariffs, mandates, and so on. If the push is big enough, then the good equilibrium is achieved and stays even after the big push policies are removed because of this virtual cycle. Remember, investments in absolute advantages can work, but what's most important is investment in comparative advantages. It turns out that if the push is too small, then you're going to be stuck in this vicious cycle. This strategy, this import substitution industrialization, was a failure, mostly due to the need for a very, very big push. It succeeded in establishing light manufacturing, but it failed to get the virtuous cycle going, except Korea, which I'm going to go over, starting in 1962. Then came the second idea, the Washington Consensus. Free trade, open borders, and everything is going to be fine. The Washington Consensus embraced the same virtuous cycle groundwork, but relied more on free markets and free trade as the starters. By opening borders and lowering tariffs, this idea, the Washington Consensus says that things are going to be all right. Things are going to be good for business. So, all sorts of pro-market reforms and opening with complementary domestic policies on education and so on are proposed and are voted. Many tried actually to apply this idea, but only a few succeeded. In particular, Latin American countries tried, but their failure could be maybe explained by other factors, such as a political context, which was not favorable to pro-market reforms. Back then, between the 80s and the 2000s in Latin America, there was a lot of political unrest with many coups coup d'etat, with many dictatorships, which with a lot of corruption, which probably limited the impact of those pro-market reforms. Finally, the third idea is that maybe we can just surrender. I talked about Danny Roderick in the very first lecture about his view on international trade. He says that maybe the right approach is to give up looking for big ideas altogether, not give up on a recipe to apply on everybody. There's one economics, but many ways to apply it. All the economies have different features, different characteristics, different types of demands, supply, political conditions, industrial policies, and so on, which means that the way they need to conduct their economic policy has to be different from the way their neighbor is doing it. In general, what has proved successful is a mixture of free market policies here and there and export-oriented policies. Not big ideas on how to develop. So more focused on industrial policies, making sure business is happening rather than trying to develop a huge industrial base by making very big, lumpy investments. It could be that the failure of development economics, which is a field of economics, is at least in part due to the changed nature of industrialization. If you take any development economics course, you will go through theoretical models about how a developing country can grow. You're going to have a lot of theories about growth, GDP growth, relying on some models made in the 1960s, in the 1950s. That turned out to be failures for most of them. Models are very simple. They don't account for many different factors that prevent some economies from growing. Many growth models, macroeconomic growth models, predict that any developing country should catch up with developed countries because they should grow faster than developed countries. Because of that, they should grow faster, have a higher GDP growth rate, and eventually catch up. It is not the case for all the countries. Many African countries in particular don't manage to have a high growth rate and don't manage to catch up. So let's go over the traditional development strategy of an industry under the first unbundling. So the conventional development ladder is to build your industrial base. So you start investing in some industry, like Korea, Taiwan, US, Germany. Many countries did it. And everything happens under the same roof. First unbundling, right? The idea then is there is this pattern, the flying geese pattern, where each goose represents a country. So think about, let's say, the lead goose, which is Japan. Japan is the first one who invested in its industrial base in Asia. And with the accumulation of competences comes an increase in wages. So eventually, an industry gets competitive because it has a very refined production process, but also loses eventually in competitiveness because of an increase in income. It is one of the reasons why many factories now are not in China anymore, but they are in Bangladesh. Incomes raised in China. Eventually, Bangladesh wages were more competitive for the same amount of know-how, the same facilities and so on. And so now in your clothes, you can find many of them being done in Bangladesh or in Pakistan. So this opens the door for the next geese in line. The next geese in line is going to become competitive in terms of wages, and they will be able to build their industrial base as well. That's what happened in the 60s, 70s, 80s with the four dragons: Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, Korea. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, their development level was pretty low compared to Western countries. Now, their GDP per capita rivals the highest ones in Western countries. So, by the time every country is developed, will the factories remain where the countries was last built? Or you mean where the factories, were last built? Where the country has the majority, or automation would take over? Oof, that's a pretty complicated question. I have no idea. Well, countries will constantly try to have an edge over each other. So, when you say by the time every country is developed, do you mean by the time they converge, they are exactly at the same income per capita? Because this is unlikely to happen. There's always going to be some discrepancy. And so there might be a case where one country has a very specific process of automation that they want to keep on their land. So in this case, the factories would have to stay there. Or it could be that technology just spreads around the world so that every country has the same technology. And in this case, it would not matter too much where goods are produced. In this case, probably countries might want to produce where the demand is located. So maybe they want to produce closer to where most of their demand is. Otherwise, I'm not sure, to be honest. That's the only arguments I can give you here. But there has been an increase now of production facilities being located closer to where the consumers are. There has been a cut in the number of intermediaries when it comes to transportations and so on and so forth. Not in big industries, but in smaller industries, and in food in particular, there has been an increase in production is more and more rebundled. When you think about agriculture, there is a lot more like organically grown, locally grown, BC grown, for instance, as opposed to 20 years ago, wherever it's coming from, it's good, it's cheap. But I'm thinking about a very specific field in particular. So, came the four dragons after Japan. The next wave is the four tigers, which are pretty much right now, or maybe 10 years ago. Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, who are also in charge of producing many manufactured goods. Like the one I'm thinking of is mechanical parts, vehicle parts. In particular, Thailand and Malaysia, which I'm going to get in a couple slides. So let's take the example of Taiwan, who from 1952 to 1976 managed to build its own industrial base and then join a supply chain, which is a pretty extreme case. So, at the end of the 1950s, they stopped the import substitution policy, promoted exports of unskilled labor-intensive manufactured goods. They started with textiles, then clothing and footwear, then electrical machinery, then non-electrical machinery and transport equipment were on the rise by the mid-70s. So they started with one industry. Once this industry was doing well enough, they move on to another industry and so on. But you can see that the next industry is slightly more sophisticated than the previous one. Textile is very basic. You have a process to make shoes or t-shirts. Or even, no, actually textile is even more basic than this. It's really literally just making pieces of cloth. Then you use those pieces of cloth to make clothes and shoes. Then you move on to electrical machinery, which is already more advanced and need more specialized workers. And so on and so forth. Now, Taiwan is a powerhouse exporter of high-tech, high-precision goods, especially electronics like Acer computers. Remember that Taiwan also has Foxconn, the managing firms, I guess you call it, that takes care of a lot of factory production in China. So Taiwan is now a powerhouse. Yeah, they have high tech, they have high skilled workers, as high skilled as the ones in Western countries, but it was definitely not the case 30 to 40 years ago. If you look at the export patterns of Taiwan between 56 and 76, huge in food, beverage, tobacco, so fairly basic agricultural goods. 48% of exports were coming from there. 10 years later, only 11%, and in 1976, 0.2, almost nothing. Textiles was at 9% at the beginning, increase to 19%, and then they move on to the next industry so that it decreased back to 14 in 76. Clothing and footwear, something, started lower than textiles because textiles were first in 1956. Increase by 5% or 6% over 10 years, and by 76 we have a huge ass 25.7%. Non-electrical machinery followed with electrical machinery. So they were pretty much at zero in 56. Big investment in electrical first. Remember, non-electrical came after electrical. And in 1976, electrical machinery was huge, whereas non-electrical machinery was still in the process of growing. So if you have more data, let's say 1986, you will find a higher percentage of non-electrical machinery and a lower percentage of electrical machinery. Yes, the slides are uploaded. I will repost them if there is any update. Transport equipment as well. Big fat goose egg in 1956. Almost a goose egg in 66 and 2.7 in 76. And then it kept growing. So it's really climbing the industrial ladder in terms of sophistication of the products and in terms of the amount of value added put in the products. With the second unbundling, however, we don't have this flying geese pattern anymore, where one country develops an industry, not competitive enough, the following countries are picking it up, and so on and so forth. Rather, we have a swarm of flying starlings, where you can see that the patterns are way more random. This is due to the fact that the second unbundling pretty much created this network of factory relationships from one country to another, and the fractionalization of the production process, the unbundling of the production process. The good thing about the second unbundling is that there is less lumpiness, there is less chunkiness. Instead of the first unbundling, where the only thing that was exportable was the final product, the motorbike, and everything else was produced under the same roof and not traded. Now, you can just stick to the muffler. I forgot what the muffler is. Some part of the motorbike. Around the exhaust, I think. You can focus on just making mufflers and export those mufflers. So in a country, there might be many mufflers being produced, but no motorcycle at all. Oh yeah, the one that suppresses the sound. Yes, thank you. Because now the activity can just stick to making intermediary inputs, because mufflers are going to go into the assembly for the motorbike. There is less lumpiness. The big push doesn't need to be as big if you want to develop an industry. You can just develop not a whole industry of making motorcycles from the ground up, but rather making motorcycle parts. So you can create comparative advantages more easily. Actually, I'm not sure what the minus and the pluses are. Sorry about that. Yep, not sure at all. So you don't need to build an entire industrial base because there is no longer an industry entirely based in one country. So rather than creating your industry, you can join an industry and say, hey, I can make your mufflers. Show me how to do it. I can make them. Instead of, I'm going to make my own motorcycles. So we went from the left-hand side of the picture with a high minimal critical effort to push the manufacturing sector. You need to make big investment to develop that industry. We went from that situation where, since you only look at a certain stage of the manufacturing process, the big push, the minimum critical effort, is not as big as before. Especially for developing countries, it is way easier to then develop your industry by joining a supply chain rather than building it from the ground up. The idea is that those countries have a strong agricultural sector at the beginning, and if you want the manufacturing sector to get some weight, you need a very big push. So the old industrialization strategy was to build your own industrial base. Korea did it, Taiwan did it, US a long time ago, Germany, Japan as well. That was the first unbundling for them. And then build your supply chain, like Korea and Malaysia. The new way to go now is to join a supply chain, like Thailand did, for instance. And then you can move up the value chain. You can start by saying, I'm going to make the doors of your cars. So you make the doors. Okay. And then say, hey, now maybe I can make your mufflers, if they are mufflers for cars. Okay. And then you can move up the value chain until you end up being the one making most of the parts in the car. Isn't it only one Korea? So, let's look at Korea. South Korea. Okay? Something switched a lot in South Korea, especially after 1997, where there was a crisis, an overall economic crisis in Asia. So if you look at the left graph, up to 97, there is a rather they have rather small small exports and imports in final cars and final parts. After 1997, well, Korea was already building its industry before, but after 1997, the exports of cars, of final products, increased a lot, as well as the exports of parts, because Korea also joined supply chains, and a rather small amount of imports of final products and parts. I'm talking about cars here, or vehicles. And the right graph is a more detailed version of the different parts. And if you look at up to 1997, it's a rather small amount, which exponentially grew for many different types of parts, because not only Korea built its own industrial base, but it also joined a supply chain. As a matter of fact, I have this stat from the book. Where is it? Yes. Let me quote this. When the 1997 Asian crisis struck, 3 of the 4 car companies went broke and were bought out. Kia was bought out by the sole survivor Hyundai. Samsung Motors, I didn't know they had motors, was bought by Renault. French car company. Hyundai. Okay, thank you guys. Daewoo Motors, formerly called Shinjin, was bought by General Motors. So they also went through a crisis where their industrial base was in trouble, but they also joined supply chains, which allowed them eventually to export a huge amount of final products as well as parts. So Korea is a special case because they built the industrial base, the supply chain, and pretty much also joined it. But if you compare Thailand with Malaysia, Thailand went the new way. So again, if you look at the year 2000 pretty much as a threshold, or 97 if you like, Thailand saw a huge increase in its exports of final cars, final products, and a relatively small amount of imports, whereas Malaysia stuck to the old way, the build your industrial base, and was stuck with a small amount of imports and exports of final parts because they did not manage to develop a competitive industry. And when it comes to parts, well, Thailand in both imports and exports is dominating because they joined a supply chain. I'm going to make your mufflers, not your cars, not your full car. Just the fact that Thailand decided to join a supply chain versus Malaysia, who tried to build industrial base, made Thailand business way better, Thailand's exports and imports way better, but mostly exports. Whereas Malaysia stayed stuck in this vicious cycle because it did not manage to provide a sufficiently big push to develop its industry. In particular, Thailand joined the supply chain with Japanese firms. You can take a look at chapter 9 in the book that talks about this case in particular, where you might wonder, well, maybe Japanese firms eventually did not want to transfer too much know-how, They did not want Thailand to know too much. But Thailand Thai firms managed to convince Japanese firms that the only thing they wanted was the production process, and they were not trying to just steal it to make their own industrial base. They wanted to keep working with Japanese firms. Japanese firms sent their know-how, sent their engineers, their experts, their highly skilled workers to Thailand to train them, and Thailand, little by little, built more and more car parts for Japanese firms. Malaysia tried to be competitive, was not competitive enough even for its own domestic market, tried to do some protectionism to protect domestic firms, but never managed to sell their cars abroad pretty much. It could be a lack of economies of scale. Maybe the amounts of units being produced were not high enough. That's totally possible. It could be a lack of other things as well, like investments and so on. Or maybe a lack of demand. Maybe the Malaysian demand was not high enough to generate profits, high enough to invest further in the production process. So, the same way I talked about key rethinks being necessary for developed nations, we have the same for developing nations. The fact that we have intra-factory flows means that there is international business, international commerce, that denationalize the comparative advantage. Sorry. And that creates a nexus, a network of cross-border flows, and so a nexus of necessary disciplines and agreements. Competitiveness involves a mix and match of comparative advantages at different production stages. So you could have a comparative advantage in making mufflers as opposed to making windows for cars. So a car company will come to you to get their mufflers produced, or motorbike company. Yes, Proton is mentioned in the book in particular for Malaysian brands, yeah. National performance depends upon non-national factors. So, as I mentioned before, regionalism matters more than before. Well, I mean, yeah. And so a regional comparative advantage matters now more for developing countries than in the past, especially since what they should do to develop is join a supply chain. So they need to have an edge in some part of the production process and tell other companies, hey, I can make this for cheaper. I can make this part for cheaper. Come to me. Instead of, I'm going to make cars from the ground up. Yes, I'm very good at making cars. I'm going to make cars. Well, you need many things to just now build a car company and become as competitive as the rest of the biggest car groups in the world. Cities matter almost as much as in developed countries for pretty much the same reason as before. But distance still matters due to face-to-face costs. This is something I will talk about next week in particular, where I will be talking about the third unbundling with a decrease in face-to-face costs and possibly its impact on the future of work, the future of globalization, the future of the world economy. So the implications are that trade and development policy must be packaged. If you're a developing country and you want to develop further, you probably need to use a customized or well-tailored trade policy. Goods, services, capital, key personnel, key labor force. Training, education, infrastructure. So as you develop, you need to invest in education, training, and so on to foster development further. Remember the Costa Rica and Intel example, which started with just Costa Rica being a good place for Intel to, what was it? A semiconductor or something like that, to build its conductors. Eventually, Costa Rica invested in its own education, and Costa Rican firms are cooperating more and more with Intel. Development policy should refocus, not just about the automobile sector, but rather the parts sector. And this is not necessarily about going from agriculture to manufacturing to service. India, for instance, is leading in terms of services. Many call centers are located in India. As a matter of fact, I called my bank very recently, HSBC, and I had to call them 2 or 3 times, I believe it was twice, for credit card problems. Both times, I got in touch with somebody with a either Indian or Pakistan accent. Not sure, but probably many of those call centers are located in India or Pakistan, the same way French call centers are located in North African countries because they speak French because of our common history, but labor force is cheaper. They can do the same job as a French person for cheaper. And so you will also hear a strong North African accent in their French. You need to think about local content restrictions and spatial and differential treatment. So those are World Trade Organization clauses that favor developing countries' treatment. One of the clauses mentions that if a developed country is doing business with a developing country should get favorable treatment. And so developing countries in this case can get more leeway in terms of the maybe tariffs they can impose, or different types of provisions proposed by the WTO. Oh yeah, you're right. The HSBC call center is for the French part is probably in Quebec. I always ask the English part because I don't know. I'm used to doing English now. Never tried actually to ask for the French part. Yeah. Global value chains killed import substitution industrialization. So Brazil cannot do it the old way, like a lot of protectionism to develop its industry, if China is now doing it the new way. Other companies will always be more competitive by getting their parts done in countries where it's cheaper, like China and so on, as opposed to a country that wants to build its own supply chain and industry from the ground up. Ignore the Chinese example. Market size changes everything. The market is so big in China that if they wanted to build an industrial base for cars, they could definitely do it. Definitely, there is enough local demand for that. And eventually, since they will be able to develop their supply chain to be competitive at the international level. When it comes to cars, though, I would say that it's probably hard to build a new supply chain now because cars come with reputation a lot. There is a lot of reputation going on. When you think about German cars or Hyundai or American cars, there is a stamp going on. There's a stamp behind those cars. Don't mention French cars. French cars sell in France. It's good enough. And smaller countries, this way, can also develop because they can be successful at attracting global value chains. Malaysia, Costa Rica, Morocco, Vietnam, those countries can just say, hey, I can make a part of your stuff, and then eventually make more parts if the labor costs are still relatively cheap, and if firms are satisfied with the work of those developing countries. Especially small countries are going to have a harder time to provide the big push that I mentioned in the old industrialization way. Again, distance still matters because face-to-face costs are costly. But don't get me wrong, it's also costly with developed nations. But this is something I will talk about next week with the third unbundling, the future of globalization, and then the future of work. Now, will this work? So will emerging and developing countries grow by following those industrialization policies? Well, it seems that it is the case. The share of developing and emerging countries in total world GDP has now gone beyond the share of developed countries for the first time in about 100 years. The Great Convergence, pretty much. This convergence is coming from some countries in specific regions. Okay? It is not general across all countries and regions. Again, it all depends on how countries conduct their own industrialization policy. At the per capita GDP level, the picture shows progress since the 1990s, but again, some regions and some countries are not catching up. I mentioned some African countries in particular, but that's also the case for some Southeast Asian countries. The progress also seems to be maybe going up, but going up at a slower and slower rate. That is also one of the arguments behind the fact that developing countries will never catch up to developed countries. The idea is that they grow, but every year they grow a bit slower than the year before. So they will get there eventually, but at a slower and slower pace. So to finish with the slide, you can see the evolution of GDP per capita over time as a percentage of the American ones. So it has increased for emerging Asia, for emerging Europe as well, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But you can see that for Latin America, it actually has decreased over time, did not do very great, pretty much stable. Middle East and North Africa did not do very well either. Same as Sub-Saharan Africa, which has been going down or pretty flat. So that overall, when you look at all emerging countries, so the gray here, the gray line, it has been slowly increasing. It's pretty much an average of all of those lines. And when you look into it, you can see that it's very different across regions. That's it for this lecture on implications on developed and developing countries. Have a good rest of your week and see you in the next one. Bye.